What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. 10 surprising facts about the famed evolutionary biologist Charles Darwin. Darwin was born on the same day as Abraham Lincoln. Both Darwin and Lincoln were born on February 12, 1809, but in much different settings. Darwin was born in a grand Georgian house on an estate overlooking the River Severn and the medieval market town of Shrewsbury, England, whereas America's 16th president was born in a crude log cabin in the Kentucky wilderness. He waited more than 20 years to publish his groundbreaking theory on evolution. Darwin's 5-year voyage around the world on HMS Beagle, which ended in 1836, provided him with invaluable research that contributed to the development of his theory of evolution and natural selection. Concerned, however, about the public and ecclesiastical acceptance of his deeply radical idea, he did not present his theory on evolution until 1858, when he made a joint announcement with British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who was about to go public with a similar concept to Darwin's. The next year, Darwin published his seminal work, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Darwin suffered from chronic illnesses. After returning from his trip around the world, Darwin began to suffer from exhaustion, eczema and chronic bouts of nausea, headaches and heart palpitations that would persist for the rest of his life. Some speculate that during his travels Darwin may have contracted a parasitic illness called Chagas disease that can eventually result in cardiac damage, which ultimately caused Darwin's death. Timothy Dickinson tells us about Charles Darwin and the depth of the human past. He composed a pro-con list to decide on whether to marry. In 1838, Darwin compiled a list of the advantages and disadvantages of marriage in 2 columns, demonstrating a logical bent even in heartfelt matters. In the marry column, children will always be a friend and companion in old age. Much better than a dog, and someone will take care of the house. In the not marry ledger, freedom to go where one liked, conversation of clever men at clubs, and loss of time. Not on Darwin's list, however, were family ties, for he married his first cousin Emma Wedgwood in 1839. He dropped out of medical school. Darwin's father was a successful doctor who groomed his son to follow in his footsteps. After spending the summer of 1825 serving as an apprentice in his father's practice, he entered one of Britain's top medical schools at the University of Edinburgh. Darwin, however, hated the sight of blood and was bored with the lectures. He dropped out of medical school and shattered his father's hopes. Darwin was studying divinity. After leaving the University of Edinburgh, the man who would challenge the established religious dogma of creationism enrolled at Cambridge to study theology. I did not then in the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word in the Bible, he later wrote. However, Darwin's faith began to waver after encountering the evils of slavery on his trip around the world and following the deaths of 3 of his children. Darwin, though, never characterized himself as an atheist. He instead referred to himself as an agnostic. He dined on exotic animals. Darwin not only studied an eclectic menagerie of animals from around the globe, he ate them as well. As a student at Cambridge, he formed the Gourmet Club, also known as the Glutton Club, for the purpose of dining on birds and beasts, which were before unknown to human palate. Darwin consumed bittern and hawk, but he was unable to finish the brown owl that was served. While circumnavigating the globe on HMS Beagle, Darwin continued his adventurous eating by snacking on armadillo, ostrich and puma, remarkably like veal in its taste, he described. The expression survival of the fittest was not coined by him. Although associated with Darwin's theory of natural selection, the phrase survival of the fittest was actually first used by English philosopher Herbert Spencer in his 1864 Principles of Biology to connect his economic and sociological theories with Darwin's biological concepts. Darwin first adopted the phrase in his 5th edition of The Origin of Species, published in 1869, by writing of natural selection that the expression often used by Mr. Herbert Spencer of the survival of the fittest is more accurate, and is sometimes equally convenient. Darwin is buried inside Westminster Abbey. After Darwin passed away on April 19, 1882, his family began preparations to bury him in the village where he had spent the last 40 years of his life. However, Darwin's friends and colleagues began a lobbying campaign to give him the high honor of burial inside London's Westminster Abbey. After newspapers and the public joined the chorus, the Dean of Westminster gave his approval. A week after his death, Darwin was laid to rest in England's most revered church near fellow scientists John Herschel and Isaac Newton. Darwin appeared on the £10 note for 18 years. Beginning in 2000, a portrait of a bearded Darwin appeared on the back of the British £10 note along with an image of HMS Beagle, a magnifying lens and flora and fauna seen on his travels. The Bank of England discontinued his £10 note in 2018, however. Charles Darwin, one of the most influential scientists in history and the father of evolutionary biology, is often remembered for his transformative theory of natural selection, but the full complexity of his life, work, and legacy extends far beyond a single idea or book, revealing a man of contradictions, curiosities, illness, privilege, passion, and a remarkably inquisitive spirit that reshaped not only science but the way humanity viewed itself, and the world it inhabited. The story of Darwin is not merely one of scientific brilliance but of personal struggle, deep introspection, cultural collisions, and moral awakening, and it begins in a curious symmetry of history. Darwin was born on the same day as Abraham Lincoln, February 12, 1809, though their respective beginnings could not have been more different. Lincoln, destined to become the 16th President of the United States and lead his fractured nation through its bloodiest war, came into the world in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky's backwoods, surrounded by frontier hardship. Darwin, on the other hand, was born into English gentility in a grand Georgian estate in Shrewsbury, England, overlooking the River Severn, surrounded by books, wealth, and scientific inquiry. His grandfather Erasmus Darwin had already been a noted physician and progressive thinker. This dual birthdate of two titanic 19th-century figures serves as a symbolic reminder that genius knows no social boundary, and that greatness can spring from either dirt floor or marble hall. Though Darwin's trajectory seemed primed for early achievement, he was not a prodigy in the traditional sense. In fact, his formal education was full of detours and disappointments, especially early on. He dropped out of medical school at the University of Edinburgh, unable to stomach the blood, brutality, and boredom of 19th-century surgery and lectures, much to the dismay of his father, who had hoped Darwin would become a respectable doctor. With no clear path, Darwin's father sent him to Christ's College, Cambridge, to study theology with the intent of grooming him for the clergy, making it all the more ironic that the man who would eventually challenge biblical literalism through evolutionary theory was once a divinity student with no doubts about the Bible's veracity. "I did not then in the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word in the Bible," Darwin later wrote, showing how far his beliefs would evolve. At Cambridge, however, Darwin's passion for nature and collecting superseded any theological focus. He befriended naturalists, beetle collectors, and professors like John Stevens Henslow who would change the course of his life. Even in his youth, Darwin's methodical, reflective mind revealed itself in unexpected ways. For instance, before he married, he famously made a pro-con list about whether or not to wed, weighing the benefits of marriage, children, companionship, a warm home, against the perceived losses, freedom, intellectual conversation, and mobility. On the marry side he scribbled, "Children, if it please God, constant companion, friend in old age, better than a dog anyhow, home and someone to take care of house," while on the not marry side he listed, "Freedom to go where one liked, conversation of clever men at clubs, loss of time." In the end, he chose to marry Emma Wedgwood, his first cousin, in 1839, a woman of strong Unitarian faith who would remain emotionally and intellectually supportive even as her husband drifted away from religious orthodoxy. Their marriage was deeply affectionate, but not without tension, especially as Darwin's beliefs evolved and Emma struggled with the spiritual implications of his science. Despite his privileged background and scholarly circle, Darwin's scientific worldview was shaped not in the ivory towers of academia but on the rocking decks of a ship. In 1831, at the age of 22, he embarked on what would become the most consequential journey of his life, a 5-year voyage aboard the HMS Beagle as a gentleman naturalist. He would travel on this expedition from the coasts of South America to the volcanic shores of the Galapagos Islands, from the rainforests of Brazil to the barren landscapes of Tierra del Fuego, and it was on this journey that he would encounter the biodiversity and geological phenomena that would eventually serve as the basis for his revolutionary theory. But he waited more than 20 years to publish his groundbreaking ideas, hesitant to unleash a theory that would upend millennia of theological certainty and social hierarchy. Though his notebooks were bursting with evidence and hypotheses by the early 1840s, Darwin feared both the reaction of the church and the impact on his deeply religious wife. It wasn't until 1858, when he received a letter from fellow naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently arrived at a similar theory, that Darwin was pushed into action. A joint presentation was arranged, and the following year, Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, a book that forever altered the trajectory of biology, anthropology, and the human self-image. But during these decades of intellectual gestation, Darwin was plagued by debilitating health issues that remain the subject of speculation. After returning from the Beagle voyage, Darwin began to experience chronic illnesses: nausea, stomach cramps, vomiting, heart palpitations, eczema, fatigue, and panic attacks that would persist for the rest of his life. Some modern researchers suggest he may have contracted Chagas disease from a parasitic bug bite in South America, while others believe he suffered from a psychosomatic disorder or cyclic vomiting syndrome. Whatever the cause, these ailments kept him largely housebound in his later years and forced him to work in intense solitude, often dictating his findings and editing manuscripts from the quiet of his downhouse study. Despite the frailty of his health, Darwin's appetite for discovery extended beyond the laboratory and into the dining room. He was also a fan of exotic food and nature. While he was at Cambridge, he started the Gourmet Club, also known as the Glutton Club, which was a group that tried animals unknown to the human palate. Among the animals consumed were hawks, bitterns, and more notoriously, a brown owl which he found repugnant. This adventurous palate followed him aboard the Beagle, where he sampled ostrich, armadillo, and even puma, which he described as remarkably like veal. His scientific instinct to experiment, test, and investigate boundaries was mirrored in this curious appetite. Yet for all his unconventionality, some phrases we associate with Darwin weren't his. He didn't coin survival of the fittest. That phrase, so often invoked to describe natural selection, was actually coined by philosopher Herbert Spencer in 1864 to connect evolutionary theory with his ideas on society and economics. Darwin, who preferred the term natural selection, later acknowledged Spencer's phrasing in the 5th edition of Origin of Species as a convenient synonym, but it was never his invention. Though Darwin spent the last 4 decades of his life largely in seclusion, publishing voluminous works on earthworms, orchids, and barnacles, his influence grew exponentially. His death on April 19, 1882, prompted an unexpected honor. Even though his family had planned a quiet burial in the village, a campaign for a more grand burial resulted from public outcry and advocacy from friends and the scientific community. The Dean of Westminster relented, and Darwin was buried inside Westminster Abbey, near scientific giants like Isaac Newton and John Herschel. It was a remarkable tribute for a man whose ideas had once been considered dangerously heretical. Even in death, Darwin remained a paradox, beloved by the public yet controversial, revered by scientists yet unsettling to clergy. His image, too, became iconic. From 2000 to 2018, Darwin's face appeared on the British £10 note, alongside illustrations of HMS Beagle, a magnifying lens, and natural specimens, symbols of his empirical worldview and scientific legacy. But perhaps the most surprising legacy of Darwin is not what he discovered, but how deeply his life reflected the very principles he described: variation, adaptation, struggle, and survival. He adapted intellectually from divinity student to scientific rebel, struggled with illness and belief, and ultimately survived skepticism and opposition to become one of the most transformative figures in modern history. In the details of his biography, we see not a dispassionate genius but a fully human thinker. Curious, conflicted, brilliant, and burdened. Someone whose personal journey mirrored the evolutionary journeys he so meticulously documented. Charles Darwin navigated the turbulent waters of science, society, and self-discovery through illness and doubt, privilege and scandal, and he left a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of life on Earth and our place in it. Though we remember him primarily for a theory, the man behind that theory remains endlessly fascinating and surprisingly human. 10 surprising facts about Charles Darwin. The revolutionary thinker beyond evolution. Charles Darwin is best known as the father of evolutionary biology, the man whose groundbreaking work on the origin of species, 1859, forever altered humanity's understanding of life on Earth. However, there is a life full of fascinating quirks, personal struggles, and unexpected contradictions hidden behind the iconic image of the bearded Victorian naturalist. From sharing a birthday with Abraham Lincoln to abandoning medical school, Darwin's life was as complex as the theories he proposed. Here are 10 surprising facts about the famed scientist that reveal the man behind the legend. 1. Darwin was born on the same day as Abraham Lincoln. Both Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln entered the world on February 12, 1809, though under vastly different circumstances. Lincoln was born in a humble log cabin in rural Kentucky, while Darwin entered life in an elegant Georgian mansion in Shrewsbury, England. Despite their divergent upbringings, both men would go on to reshape the world, Lincoln through politics and the abolition of slavery, Darwin through science and the theory of evolution. Interestingly, their deaths were also linked by timing. Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, while Darwin passed away in 1882, but both left legacies that continue to influence modern thought. 2. He waited over 20 years to publish his theory of evolution. The 5-year voyage that Darwin took aboard the HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836 laid the groundwork for his theories on natural selection. Yet, despite gathering overwhelming evidence, he delayed publishing his theory for more than 2 decades. Why? Fear of backlash. Darwin knew his ideas would challenge religious and scientific orthodoxy. Personal anxiety. He suffered from chronic illness and feared controversy. Competition. Darwin finally went public after Alfred Russel Wallace independently proposed a similar theory in 1858. The result was On the Origin of Species, 1859, a book that ignited one of history's greatest scientific revolutions. 3. Darwin suffered from mysterious chronic illness. After returning from his voyage, Darwin was plagued by exhaustion, vomiting, heart palpitations, and eczema. Speculated causes include Chagas disease from a bug bite in South America, psychosomatic stress, due to his controversial work, lifelong anxiety disorder. Despite his ailments, Darwin maintained an astonishing work ethic, publishing over 19 books and thousands of letters. 4. He made a pro-con list to decide whether to marry. In 1838, the ever-logical Darwin listed the pros and cons of marriage. Pros: marry. Cons: not marry. Children: freedom to travel. Constant companion: less time for science. Better than a dog: conversation at men's clubs. In 1839, he tied the knot with Emma Wedgwood, his first cousin. They had 10 children, though 3 died tragically young, a grief that deeply affected Darwin. 5. Darwin dropped out of medical school because he hated blood. His father, a wealthy physician, expected Darwin to follow in his footsteps. But after witnessing surgery without anesthesia, a horrifying experience in the 1820s, Darwin abandoned medicine. Instead, he studied theology at Cambridge. Ironic for a man who later challenged religious creationism. 6. He was part of a glutton club that ate exotic animals. At Cambridge, Darwin joined the Gourmet Club, dedicated to eating birds and beasts unknown to human palate. His menu included hawk, indescribable; bittern, a heron-like bird; brown owl, too disgusting to finish. Later on the Beagle he dined on armadillo, tastes like duck, and puma, like veal. 7. He never said survival of the fittest. Though often attributed to Darwin, the phrase was coined by Herbert Spencer in 1864. Darwin adopted it later in The Origin of Species, but preferred natural selection. The misunderstanding highlights how Darwin's ideas were simplified and sometimes misused in popular culture. 8. Darwin was buried in Westminster Abbey, despite challenging religion. After his death in 1882, Darwin's family planned a quiet burial. But a public campaign led to his interment in Westminster Abbey, near Isaac Newton and John Herschel. The Church of England, which had opposed his theories, now honored him, a sign of science's growing prestige. 9. He appeared on the British £10 note for 18 years. From 2000 to 2018, Darwin's portrait graced the UK's £10 note, alongside HMS Beagle and sketches of his research. The Bank of England called him one of the most influential scientists in history. 10. Darwin never called himself an atheist. Though his work undermined biblical creationism, Darwin avoided militant atheism. He described himself as an agnostic and wrote, "The mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us." His wife, Emma, a devout Christian, feared for his soul, yet their marriage remained loving. Conclusion: the man behind the myth. Darwin was more than just the face of evolution. He was a complex, conflicted, and deeply human figure. His life reminds us that even the greatest scientific minds are shaped by personal struggles, cultural pressures, and unexpected quirks. From medical school dropout to revolutionary thinker, from adventurous eater to chronic invalid, Darwin's story is as full of surprises as the natural world he sought to explain.